The Boston Massacre, known as the Incident on King Street by the British, was an incident on March 5, 1770, in which British Army soldiers killed 5 male civilians and injured 6 others. The incident was heavily propagandized by leading patriots, such as Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, to fuel animosity towards the British authorities. British troops had been stationed in Boston, capital of the province of Massachusetts Bay, since 1768 in order to protect and support Crown-appointed colonial officials attempting to enforce unpopular parliamentary legislation. Amid ongoing tense relations between the population and the soldiers, a mob formed around a British sentry, who was subjected to verbal abuse and harassment. He was eventually supported by 8 additional soldiers, who were subjected to verbal threats and thrown objects. They fired into the crowd, without orders, instantly killing 3 people and wounding others. 2 more people died later of wounds sustained in the incident. The crowd eventually dispersed after acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson promised an inquiry, but reformed the next day, prompting the withdrawal of the troops to Castle Island. 8 soldiers, 1 officer, and 4 civilians were arrested and charged with murder. Defended by the lawyer and future American President, John Adams, 6 of the soldiers were acquitted, while the other 2 were convicted of manslaughter and given reduced sentences. The men found guilty of manslaughter were sentenced to branding on their hand. Depictions, reports, and propaganda about the event, notably the colored engraving produced by Paul Revere, further heightened tensions throughout the 13 colonies. Background: Boston, the capital of the province of Massachusetts Bay and an important shipping town, was a major center of resistance to unpopular acts of taxation by the British Parliament in the 1760s. In 1768, the Townshend Acts were placed upon the colonists, by which a variety of common items that were manufactured in Britain and exported to the colonies were subjected to import tariffs. Colonists objected that the Townshend Acts were a violation of the natural, charter, and constitutional rights of British subjects in the colonies. The Massachusetts House of Representatives began a campaign against the Townshend Acts by sending a petition to King George III asking for the repeal of the Townshend Revenue Act. The House also sent what became known as the Massachusetts Circular Letter to other colonial assemblies, asking them to join the resistance movement, and called for a boycott of merchants importing the affected goods. In Great Britain, Lord Hillsborough, who had recently been appointed to the newly created office of Colonial Secretary, was alarmed by the actions of the Massachusetts House. In April 1768 he sent a letter to the colonial governors in America, instructing them to dissolve the colonial assemblies if they responded to the Massachusetts Circular Letter. He also ordered Massachusetts Governor Francis Burner to direct the Massachusetts House to rescind the letter. The House refused to comply. Boston's chief customs officer, Charles Paxton, wrote to Hillsborough, asking for military support because the government is as much in the hands of the people as it was in the time of the Stamp Act. Commodore Samuel Hood responded by sending the 50-gun warship HMS Romney, which arrived in Boston Harbor in May 1768. On June 10, 1768, customs officials seized the Liberty, a sloop owned by leading Boston merchant John Hancock, on allegations that the ship had been involved in smuggling. Bostonians, already angry because the captain of the Romney had been impressing local sailors, began to riot. Customs officials fled to Castle William for protection. Daniel Calf declares that on Saturday evening the 3rd of March, a camp woman, wife to James McDeed, a grenadier of the 29th, came into his father's shop, and the people talking about the affrays at the rope walks, and blaming the soldiers for the part they had acted in it. The woman said, the soldiers were in the right, adding that before Tuesday or Wednesday night they would wet their swords or bayonets in New England people's blood. Excerpt from a short narrative, suggesting the soldiers were contemplating violence against the colonists given the unstable state of affairs in Massachusetts. Hillsborough instructed General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief, North America, to send such force as you shall think necessary to Boston. On October 1, 1768, the first of 4 British Army regiments began disembarking in Boston. 2 regiments were removed from Boston in 1769, but the 14th and the 29th Regiments of Foot remained. The Journal of Occurrences, an anonymously written series of newspaper articles, chronicled clashes between civilians and soldiers while troops were stationed in Boston, feeding tensions with its sometimes exaggerated accounts of the events. Tensions rose markedly after Christopher Sider, a young lad about 11 years of age, was killed by a customs employee on February 22, 1770. Sider's death was glorified in the Boston Gazette, and his funeral was described as one of the largest of the time in Boston. The killing and subsequent propaganda inflamed tensions, with gangs of colonists looking for soldiers to harass, and soldiers also on occasion looking for confrontation. Incident. On the evening of March 5, Private Hugh White, a British soldier, stood on guard duty outside the Custom House on King Street, today known as State Street. A young wig-maker's apprentice named Edward Garrick called out to a British officer, Captain Lieutenant John Goldfinch, that Goldfinch had not paid a bill due to Garrick's master. Goldfinch had in fact settled his account and ignored the insult. Private White called out to Garrick that he should be more respectful of the officer. Garrick exchanged insults with Private White, who left his post, challenged the boy, and struck him on the side of the head with his musket. As Garrick cried in pain, one of his companions, Bartholomew Broaders, began to argue with White. This attracted a larger crowd. Henry Knox, a 19-year-old bookseller, came upon the scene and warned White, if he fired he must die for it. As the evening progressed, the crowd around Private White grew larger and more boisterous. Church bells were rung, which usually signified a fire, bringing more people out. Over 50 Bostonians pressed around White, led by a mixed-race runaway slave named Crispus Attucks, throwing objects at the sentry and challenging him to fire his weapon. White, who had taken up a somewhat safer position on the steps of the Custom House, sought assistance. Runners alerted the nearby barracks and Captain Thomas Preston, the officer of the watch. According to his report, Preston dispatched a non-commissioned officer and 6 privates of the 29th Regiment of Foot, with fixed bayonets, to relieve White. The soldiers Preston sent were Corporal William Weems, Hugh Montgomery, John Carroll, William Macaulay, William Warren, and Matthew Kilroy. Accompanied by Preston, they pushed their way through the crowd. En route, Henry Knox, again trying to reduce tensions, warned Preston, for God's sake, take care of your men. If they fire, you must die. Captain Preston responded, I am aware of it. When they reached Private White on the Custom House stairs, the soldiers loaded their muskets, and arrayed themselves in a semicircular formation. Preston shouted at the crowd, estimated to number between 300 and 400, to disperse. The crowd continued to press around the soldiers, taunting them by yelling, fire, by spitting at and throwing snowballs and other small objects at them. Richard Palms, a local innkeeper who was carrying a cudgel, came up to Preston and asked if the soldiers' weapons were loaded. Preston assured him they were, but that they would not fire unless he ordered it, and that he was unlikely to do so, since he was standing in front of them. A thrown object then struck Private Montgomery, knocking him down and causing him to drop his musket. He recovered his weapon, and was thought to angrily shout, "Damn you, fire," then discharged it into the crowd, although no command was given. Palms swung his cudgel first at Montgomery, hitting his arm, and then at Preston. He narrowly missed Preston's head, striking him on the arm instead. There was a pause of uncertain length, after which the soldiers fired into the crowd. Rather than a disciplined volley, a ragged series of shots was fired, which hit 11 men. 3 Americans, rope-maker Samuel Gray, mariner James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks, died instantly. Samuel Maverick, an apprentice ivory turner of 17, was struck by a ricocheting musket ball at the back of the crowd, and died a few hours later. In the early morning of the next day, an Irish immigrant, Patrick Carr, died 2 weeks later. Christopher Monk, another apprentice, was one of those seriously wounded in the attack. Although he recovered to some extent, he was crippled and eventually died in 1780. Purportedly due to the injuries he had sustained in the attack a decade earlier. The crowd moved away from the immediate area of the Custom House, but continued to grow in nearby streets. Captain Preston immediately called out most of the 29th Regiment, which adopted defensive positions in front of the State House. From its balcony he was able to minimally restore order, promising there would be a fair inquiry into the shootings if the crowd dispersed.